In a previous episode of Beyond the Dark, we explored the past of Vietnam veteran Campo Elias Delgado and how his traumatic childhood had adverse effects in his later life. In this episode, we shall explore the moment he finally snapped and changed his life, along with many others, forever. It's 7 AM and it's a bitter morning in the capital, and although the frost is creeping up the apartment windows like vine and turning the once green grass to ice, Campo lies in his bed coated in a layer of sweat. He stirs from his troubled sleep and gets up despite the tiredness slowing his movements, and gets himself dressed and prepared for the busy day. While packing up his briefcase for today's lesson with Claudia, he decides to pack a few books he borrowed from Mendoza just a few days before with the intent to stop by his home. There is one book in particular Delgado has become almost obsessed with, the classic novel The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. At some point, Delgado even gifted a copy to Claudia, who quickly fell in love with the plot and started using it as a tool to help with her English studies. As an interesting side note, Campo once asked Mario if he believes it is possible for two very different personalities to coexist in the same person. This concept fascinated and somewhat terrified Delgado so much that he began writing an essay on the book. After packing up all he needs for the lesson, Campo finds himself at an impasse as there are two items in particular he's contemplating bringing: his hunting knife and some rope. Over the past year, he has become so reclusive that his moderate social circle has dwindled to a handful of people, and even then he has burnt bridges to many he used to call friends. His calm demeanor and confidence he wore so well is now merely a distant memory. He places the final items into the briefcase before leaving the bedroom and passing by his mother to make himself some coffee. The bruise she wears on her face is a stark reminder of his escalating violence, but he doesn't show any remorse. It used to be resentment he felt towards her, but looking back, that feeling seems rather childish. He doesn't resent her. No, he hates her. Everything that has ever happened to him is because of her. Every mistake, every failed relationship, every slight, every foolish decision he has ever made was because she was the one who made him do it. At least this is how Campo feels. Rita Delgado watches this husk of a man she used to know as her son go through his morning routine in a daze. A year ago, she would have asked if he was okay and sat down with him to have a heart-to-heart, maybe even attempt to fix their fractured relationship. But she's learned it's best to stay out of this violent thug's way. She's never seen so much rage in a person's eyes. After grabbing his coat and putting on his shoes, Campo looks back at his mother, simply saying he'll be back later, and leaves the apartment. Walking down the street, he passes by endless commuters as they prepare for their 9 to 5s. Among the crowd, Campo blends perfectly in his well-cut suit, appearing like a businessman who's about to spend his morning crunching numbers. Upon arriving at the home of Mario Mendoza, he knocks at the door and waits for a response. However, he doesn't know that Mendoza is currently out running some morning errands. So with a slight hitch in his plans, he walks across the street to a small cafe and waits for his friend's return. But after waiting an hour with no sight of him, he gets frustrated and heads towards the bank to make a withdrawal. It's now around 10 AM, and Campo is currently waiting in line, listening to the general chatter about tonight's football match coming from the people behind him. He's clearly showing signs of frustration. The fact that Mario wasn't home has already sent the unstable Campo slowly spiraling into a rage. But no one at the bank batters an eye. As he waits for what feels like an eternity, it's finally his turn. He composes himself and walks up to the female bank teller with a wish to withdraw all of his money from his account. What exactly he planned to do with it isn't quite known, but the funds equate to nearly 50,000 Colombian pesos. His request isn't an unusual one, but when the teller hands over his money, she leaves some change in his account. This simple action breaks any composure Campo had managed to muster, and his barely restrained anger comes to the surface. Screaming at the poor woman, he demands for the full amount to be taken out and his account to be immediately closed down. This violent outburst from Delgado causes everyone to stare at him with disgust, and his little outburst is the only reason he is remembered. After snatching the last bit of his money out of the hands of the teller, he storms out of the building shouting obscenities at her, and after cutting across town, he makes his way to his second to last stop at a firearm shop. It's here where he purchases multiple boxes of .32 caliber rounds and stuffs them into his briefcase. Now, according to some sources, it's also here where Campo purchases the firearm he would later use, but according to his close friends, he always had it, and in fact was quite proud of the sidearm as he would claim it was his service pistol. Afterwards, with his rage still simmering, he leaves the store and attempts to calm himself down on the walk towards the apartment complex to meet with his student, 15-year-old Claudia Rincon. It's now around 2 p.m, and doorman Juan Villamezar is happy to see that the chill that came with the morning frost has started to lift. His job is a rather simple one, really, with opening the door to the residence, accepting packages, and answering inquiries to anyone seemingly lost. Apart from being on his feet for most of the day, he can't really complain. The pay is reasonable, and he takes pride in his occupation. It's been a slow day so far, so he's currently entertaining himself reading today's newspaper. As he glances up, he notices a regular visitor to the building. He doesn't know too much about the man, but from the small conversations they've had, he seems quite pleasant. He's an English teacher to one of the residents, if he recalls correctly. He opens the door with a greeting and they share some usual small talk before the man pushes the button for the elevator. Juan does notice how the man seems to be in a bit of a sweat, but he just chalks that up to the now warm day. After having a chat with the doorman, Campo steps into the elevator and pushes the button for the 3rd floor. It's in here that he purposely removes his suit jacket just before he arrives at Claudia's apartment. After arriving and knocking on the door, he is greeted by Claudia's mother, Nora Rincon. She is surprised to see Campo in a disheveled state, but nonetheless invites him to come through to the kitchen, whereupon she offers him a drink. But Campo doesn't want any refreshments, or is he here to teach Claudia? In a matter of seconds, he removes the hunting knife from his briefcase and slashes Nora across the face. As she falls backwards in shock, Campo seizes her arms and uses the rope to tie her hands. Now restrained, he stands over his gagged and bound victim and raises the knife. He releases all of his pent-up rage he's held onto for the past few years by repeatedly and viciously stabbing Nora. Why exactly Delgado committed this murder is still largely unknown, and so is his next act. As if brutalizing Nora wasn't enough, Delgado moves into Claudia's bedroom, leaving a trail of bloody footprints behind him. Throughout the whole ordeal of her mother being murdered, Claudia has been blissfully unaware in her bedroom, presumably listening to music. Something catches her attention, and as she looks up, she is horrified to see her teacher covered in claret. She freezes. utterly petrified. Campo rushes at the young girl and once again restrains his victim by tying her to the bed, and sadly, Claudia meets the same fate as her mother as she is stabbed 22 times. After this horrendous act, Campo heads into the bathroom where he washes the knife and his hands in the sink, leaving behind a bloody stain. After he heads to the front door, whereupon he puts on his suit jacket to cover up any blood on his shirt, he leaves the apartment. On the way out of the building, however, his presence doesn't go unnoticed, as Juan spots the man who appears to be in a hurry. What Juan doesn't know is that Campo has just taken the lives of 2 of the residents, and they will be the last to be discovered. It's now around 4 PM, and Campo has finally made it back to his mother's apartment, but what exactly happens next isn't clear due to conflicting reports. According to some, Campo and his mother can be heard shouting through the walls, but what makes this event different from the previous times is that Rita Delgado doesn't appear to back down. But just as quickly as it begins, an unsettling silence descends. Some reports claim in the heat of the moment, Campo unsheathed his hunting knife once more to claim his mother's life, while others state he grabbed a claw hammer and struck down the 73-year-old woman. But one source states that in a fit of rage, Delgado decided to go into his bedroom, load his revolver, and empty all 6 chambers into his unsuspecting mother. How Rita Delgado perished at the hands of her son still isn't quite known. However, what happens next is sadly all too clear. After dragging the body onto the coffee table and covering it in newspaper that's been doused with a flammable substance, Delgado makes his way to the front door and looks around the apartment one last time. He strikes a match and throws it onto the table. The apartment and the body of his mother immediately go up in flames as the overpowering stench of cooking flesh drift into the corridor. Campo calmly leaves what used to be his home, making sure to shut the door and his previous life behind him. And after taking a deep breath and heading to the floor below, he unholsters the revolver and begins his first massacre. Scrambling down the hallway, Campo begins shouting at the top of his lungs that there is a fire in the building, and immediately starts banging on the first door he comes across, apartment 301. Inside, students Inez Gordy Galat and Nelsie Patricia Cortez, who were in the middle of watching TV, both stop when they hear the commotion and immediately head for the door. But instead of seeing someone in the grips of fear, they are instead greeted by Campo holding up the .32 caliber revolver. Without hesitation, he fires 2 rounds, each with calculated and deadly precision, executing them both. It is at this moment when 50-year-old teacher Gloria Isabel Leon opens her door to investigate the source of the deafening blast. When Delgado sees the woman peer out, he simply raises the firearm and peels off another round, and Gloria slumps against the doorframe, fatally wounded. After this, Campo runs down the corridor and another flight of stairs where he makes it to his final stop of apartment 101. Inside are 3 young women, Matilda Gonzalez, Mercedes Gamboa, and Berta Gomez. After ringing the doorbell, Campo is greeted by Matilda, and the sight of this disheveled man concerns her. Campo does something rather bizarre and pleads for Matilda to call the fire department, and for some reason, he waits until she picks up the telephone, at which point he draws the revolver once more and fires. Berta Gomez, who was still in the living room, quickly hides in the interior patio of the apartment, and luckily for her, Campo doesn't note her presence, but sadly, Mercedes Gamboa is unable to do the same and is shot. Delgado calmly puts his revolver away and heads towards the front of the building as Berta rushes to help Mercedes, but it's clear that her wounds are far too severe. She would later die at San Jose Hospital. Outside the front of the building, a poster showing a local production of Garcia Lorca's Blood Wedding catches Delgado's eye, and for reasons unknown, causes him to stop. He stands there frozen for a time as if in a trance, and considering the violence he just committed, you'd expect him to leave the scene as quickly as possible. But no. For reasons we will never comprehend, he acts as if he has all the time in the world. It's during this moment of introspection, a relative of the 50-year-old schoolteacher from apartment 302 passes by, but his strange demeanor causes her to glance at Delgado, and she notes how he seems to be almost peaceful. After a few minutes, Campo straightens up and calmly walks down the street, making for his next stop. At around 5:30 p.m., Campo arrives at the home of Donna Clemencia de Castro and her husband, Jesus Fernandez. They are some of the few friends he hasn't burned bridges with. After knocking on the door and being greeted by Donna, Campo sheepishly asks if her husband is home, but she informs him that he is currently out. He picks up the briefcase with a sad smile and leaves the apartment, where he walks towards his final destination.